talking corn. A yummy and delicious snack, but also a horrifying movie from 2021, also known as C.O.R.N, A Field of Screams. See what they did there? Written and directed by Robin Christensen. It stars Kennedy Tucker, Mateus Ward, Roger Cross, who's the only kind of face I really recognise here, along with a host of nubile young actors ready to get killed off to kind of give this movie a body count. Now, you may be thinking this is a kind of scarecrow movie, and although there are a couple of scarecrows in it, it's actually more along the lines, I would say, of kind of like a waxwork style film. Now, what's the story? Well, it focuses on a brother and sister, a young brother and sister, as they are travelling in a car with their stepfather when the car gets a flat. And they happen to be in this kind of area, remote kind of farmland area. And there's no, mobile phone receptionist, there never is in these type of places. So the father decides he's going to go walk to the next town and try and get some help. In the meantime, teenagers being teenagers, they can't stay in one place for very long. They decide to have a little bit of a walk around, end up becoming friendly with a group of kind of local teens, and there is a kind of corn maze party, things like this. They just kind of end up going in there. However, there is a sinister presence at foot. There seems to be a group of people who are doing some sick and twisted things with any young person that they kind of come across, actually doing weird sort of, let's call it artwork, involving taxidermy and humans. That's all I'm going to say on the plot here. Let's discuss what I think works for the movie. I have to say, I actually think the broad plot synopsis, the basic beats of the plot here are actually fairly interesting. It kind of goes in a somewhat like of a genre which is fairly kind of unexplored. Like I've said, I think Waxworks is probably kind of the most comparable film, but it's not exactly kind of like that. And that feels quite an interesting and fresh take for an idea for a horror film. It is kind of similar beats to what you've seen before, but like I've said, I feel it kind of somewhat carves its own path to a certain degree, mixing in things like the kind of the Waxworks idea, but also kind of like traditional kind of slasher motifs and kind of like the spookiness of Halloween cornfields and hayrides and those kind of aesthetics as well. Another kind of aspect of the story that I quite like is character motivations are not always what they appear to be, and there are certain characters that we're introduced to that may end up being, helpful, some characters that may be more problematic, but you're never quite sure who's going to be falling kind of what category, because their actions sometimes seem a little bit contradictory. So we're kind of introduced to a fairly kind of large cast here, and like I said, some will be kind of helpful and some won't be, but it won't always be immediately apparent, which is which I thought was quite good, and it genuinely kind of like gives an element of kind of mystery. You're not quite sure maybe who's involved and who maybe isn't, and I think that actually part of the movie is done very well. I actually didn't think some of the acting here was too bad. Some of the acting, put a pin in that, because there are others where I feel it's a little less so, but certainly I would say are more kind of main characters as such. I think they actually do a decent enough job here of giving kind of like performances. The movie obviously has its kind of tongue-in-cheek, where I think there's some quite amusing jokes, many puns about scarecrows and this kind of stuff like that. And there is one particularly kind of gory scene shot in a very kind of unique way. Let me just kind of put it like that. That is pretty gruesome and kind of graphic, I have to say. So let's talk about maybe what doesn't work quite as well. Let me just kind of go back to a couple of things that I have kind of said and kind of maybe look at the flip side of the coin here. Let's talk about the acting first of all. Like I said, I do think that some of the performances are fine. They do a good enough job, I feel, for the level of movie this is. But there are some characters, and I would say certainly that are introduced in the latter half of this movie, smaller roles where I feel the acting is definitely not above par and a little bit hammy and stilted at times. Luckily, these tend to be smaller parts, but nonetheless, they kind of do stick out as being kind of wooden. I guess my main, so there's a couple of other issues I have with the story which are sort of similar, really. So I have to say, I think as the movie progresses, it gets a little bit convoluted. I think it gets a little less interesting, and I think the movie's a little long. So I think the setup of this film, certainly the first half is interesting. It's, you know, it sets up somewhat of a mystery. You know, you're not quite sure what is kind of going on, who's involved, like I've said. But the second half, and certainly the third act, is definitely the weakest part of the movie. Because it just seems to kind of drag its heels and never really, you feel like it's not kind of getting to the point. The movie's probably a little bit too long, I would say about 15 to 20 minutes, and it certainly, I would say, needs to come off the latter half of the film, because that really does start to kind of drag in that kind of second half. And again, I would say particularly the last act of the movie, the last third, is definitely the weakest element of the film. So the pacing side of stuff, it really does kind of start to drag at the times. I have to say as well, there are elements, like I've said right at the beginning of the review, the broad story strokes here I think are interesting, and it sets up a good story. However, there are smaller elements within, and I'm not going to spoil them for you, there are smaller plot points that in this movie that simply do not make sense. They are illogical, they you know, you start thinking about it thinking, this just doesn't make sense. You know, and it really does undermine what I think was quite an interesting premise, because, you know, the broad strokes are fine, but then we kind of look into the minutiae of the detail, and it just, things happen, characters do certain things, and, you know, again, I'm going to give you some very broad some very broad examples here. The scarecrows, why are they even there? Because it doesn't make sense. The modus operandi of what the antagonists are actually about doesn't make sense. The teenagers that are two main characters, these have got to be the most irresponsible teenagers I think you ever could have put to see on film. You know, if you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere, I honestly can't believe people will just go off and in party with a bunch of random people, and then they kind of seem to get really kind of like chummy with them very quickly. It doesn't really make sense. There's just things here, and there's other elements as well. I'm not mentioning everything there, but there are elements here that just don't seem, you know, illogical, they don't quite ring true, and unfortunately undermine what I think was actually quite a kind of a fun idea. And to be honest, I think there's less done with the kind of the premise than there could have been. As I said, there is one particularly kind of gory scene in the movie, and that's kind of, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. I mean, you've obviously set the bar there where we have a very gory scene, but then we kind of don't really have much else. You know, the idea is there, and we see some things kind of more after the fact, but it could have had a little bit more of that in regards to it. Overall, I still think the actual premise is quite fun. I quite like the characterisation of our brother and sister. I actually think they kind of do seem a lot like a brother and sister, and in the kind of the way they're acting. I mean, there are other characters here that I don't feel have particularly kind of good characterisation, and I do think these, our brother and sister, are written to be, like, as I say, particularly kind of irresponsible and don't seem realistic, but their interactions I did enjoy. The broad strokes are quite good, but it just ultimately is undermined itself by, I think, becoming just a little bit ill-conceived at times. I'll give this movie I'll give it a 5 out of 10. I was going between a 4 and a 5 here, but I do think there isn't maybe enough here to just kind of warrant it being just about an average movie. So be that as the best praise I can kind of give it. 5 out of 10, have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.